Hello and welcome back. In this video we're going to take a close look at restoring old photographs and prints and slides, and using some of the new tools in Photoshop and Lightroom we'll show you how you can restore even an image as badly damaged as this one, or even some of the old family type of photographs that are not particularly good quality. We'll show you how, using some of the new tools in Photoshop and Lightroom, we can bring these back to life. And also, if you've been a slide or transparency worker for many years, we'll show you how you can scan slides and negatives and bring the best information out of them. So let's have a look and get started. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to scan an old slide using a dedicated film scanner. Now, these are pretty rare to find these days, but if you happen to come across one, they're well worthwhile having, because they'll scan at a higher resolution than a flatbed scanner. This is an old Nikon film scanner that scans at 4000 dpi, but unfortunately the software that came with this doesn't work with the later versions of Windows and Mac operating systems, so we have to use a third-party piece of software. But let's put the slide in and get started, and we'll show you how the software works. First thing we do is we need to make sure that there's no residual dust floating about on the slide, so we give that a good clean, and then simply insert it into the scanner, and the scanner will do a preview for us. So let's now have a look at the software and see how the software will operate. Now, I mentioned that the Nikon film scanner has really old software. The item's about 20 years old, and the software no longer works with later operating systems. But there is a newer piece of software called ViewScan, which we can use, and which works really well with the scanner. And it is available to purchase over the internet. And let's have a look at what the software can do for us. Firstly, we need to make sure that we're looking at the right sort of scanner. Now, this is a Nikon LS50 film scanner, and what we want is the professional options. There are basic and standard options, but we're professionals. We want the best range of options available to us. We're scanning an image. We're going to make it a 24-bit RGB file. The preview resolution doesn't really matter. That's just to check that we've got the alignment right. But what we want is the scan resolution at 4000 dpi. That's most important. And the autofocus will work on the preview. We don't need to do most of these, but what we will do is we will set the destination folder, and when it comes to things like cropping, we'll see that once we do the test scan. And there are filters available for cleaning dust and specks off. I found that the medium setting works about the best. We can tick the boxes for restoring colors and restoring fading. It does some sort of a job in reducing color fading depending on the type of transparency or negative, so it's worthwhile trying those out, but you may find that they work better without those settings. And I just use a light amount of grain reduction because I'm going to use the software to remove any artifacts and problems, and we don't want to do any sharpening on the scan because we're going to do that with the software later on. When it comes to color, I'm just leaving that as a neutral color balance at this stage, and then we have an output option, and what we want to make sure is that we output as a raw file. We don't want any of these other formats. Raw file gives us the most information that we can work with, and you'll see it comes in as a DNG file, 24-bit color. And let's do a preview of that slide, and it takes a few seconds to do a quick scan and give us a look at the preview. And then finally, while we're looking at that, there's preferences here. You can change a whole lot of various settings, but for this purpose we're just going to look at the main ones, and that is our output settings. Now, this slide is typical of many slides that would have been taken over the last 20 or so years. Usually with color transparencies we like to underexpose the slide slightly to try and saturate the colors, but that makes it really difficult for scanning because a lot of the deep shadows are blocked up. And in this case it's telling me that it's made a focus point here on this part of the image. Hopefully it was sharp when we took the photograph, and you'll see that it's auto cropped the image. So with those settings available, what we'll do is now we will scan the image and save that to file, and then we can look at the adjustments and restoration using the software. And the scanning will take a few seconds, and you can see here that as it scans, it's picking up here, initially showing me all the dust and grime on the slide, and that's not unusual. And even in the processing of slides, there was often specks of dust and defects on the slides that would be introduced during the processing. But we can remove those, and most of those will disappear once we get into the software within the scanner software. That will remove a lot of it, and then we can get rid of the rest once we get it into Lightroom and Photoshop. So the scanning takes a little while because it's 4000 dpi, which is much higher resolution than the actual film is capable of. The film at best is about 6 megapixels for a full frame slide, and of course film is nowhere near as sharp as a digital image, so we have to do a bit of work to restore not only the colors and the tonal range, but also the resolution and the sharpness of the image. So there's our image scanned, and you'll see that the processing has removed a lot of that dust and specks, but the image looks pretty flat. That's okay, we're going to work on that in the software. So now we have the slide scanned and brought into Lightroom, and the first thing you'll see is that it looks overall a little bit too dark because the exposure on the scanner has tried to balance this really bright area of sky with the rest of the image. But looking at the histogram, you can see here's the bright area of sky, there's no detail there whatsoever, and down in the dark areas it looks like we might still just have a little bit of detail in the shadow areas, so we're going to work with that. And looking at the other information, we'll see here that it's about a 15-16 megapixel image, and that's probably all the detail that we can hope to extract from a slide. So to keep things simple for comparison purposes, I've made a virtual copy of this, and this is where we'll do our processing in Lightroom. So we'll move over into Develop, and you'll see here the first thing I did was make a virtual copy. There is no processing applied here, everything's basically set at 0, and there's no sharpening done here. This is the default settings in Lightroom, basically nothing done. First thing I'm going to do is I realize that bright sky is really of no use to us, so I'm going to crop that down to get rid of most of that sky. In fact, we'll crop it a little bit tighter still, and so we're just going to concentrate on this small boy, and you'll see even at this level, zooming in, you can see a lot of muck and grime on the slide. There's a fair bit of what we would call noise nowadays, but that's basically the film grain, so we've got a little bit of work to do to make this work. Just make a few adjustments to the cropping, and then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over to the basic panel, and we're going to lift up the shadows. You'll see here that I've brought the shadows up quite considerably. That's brought out a lot more information in these darker areas, and I'm going to adjust that as well with a little bit of increase in exposure, because now we don't have that bright sky behind to worry about. We don't have to worry about that. We can lift up the overall exposure, and you'll see there that there is detail in this slide, but it was just not visible before. And then what I'm going to do now is make a small adjustment to the blacks to try and keep that consistent, and then do some further lightening of the shadows just to try and give us our best possible exposure. And I've just tweaked that a little bit, and then further on I just increased the contrast slightly just to try and give us a bit more realistic looking image, and I think I just pulled the blacks down. And then the next thing I did was I looked at the white balance. All of this gravel behind has got a bit of a magenta cast to it, and we're just going to use the auto white balance in Lightroom just to bring that up, and that looks pretty good actually. So it's changed the white balance slightly, and you'll see there that that's a lot more realistic looking already. And then just looking at the highlights, just adjusted that slightly, adjusted the whites a little bit, and again just tweaking that exposure setting so that we can try and bring the slide up as far as we can to the right hand side. You'll see here that there's really a big gap in the blacks area, but there's not really any detail in this dark part of the baby sheep. There was nothing on the film, and there's nothing much there that we can bring out of it. And then I just made sure that with the sharpening we just brought that right back to nothing, and then we've got the image ready to take into software. Now the pieces of software we're going to use with this are two Topaz plugins. One is Topaz Denoise and the other is Topaz Sharpen AI. And typically, if this was a raw file, I would take this straight into Topaz from Lightroom, but unfortunately, being a DNG file, we don't get the benefit of working on the raw data where we would with an image straight out of the camera. So we're going to take this now into into Photoshop and do some adjustments there. So let's move on into Photoshop. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop. For comparison purposes, this is the original scan file before I tweaked it in Lightroom, and then here is the raw file that I adjusted in Lightroom and then opened in Photoshop, and then here we have the final image that I have done the adjustments to. So we're going to work through what I did to this image to bring it out and improve it overall. And the first thing we do is, because this is a scanned slide film, we're going to have some issues with the grain and the muck on the image. So I've already done this, but I'll do this step by step and repeat it. So first thing I'm going to do is make a duplicate of the background, and that is so that we've got comparison all the way through. Normally you may not need to do this, you can flatten this as you go. But with the copy made of the background image, if you've got the Topaz collection or some of the Topaz filters installed, you'll go through to Topaz Labs, and the first thing we want to go into is Topaz Denoise. And I'll just open this up and bring it back over onto this screen. And the first thing you'll see, well, we'll move the point here so that we can see the face of the little chap. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a look here at the comparison view, where we can see a comparison of some of the different noise reduction models which are here. You'll see here that the raw model here is grayed out, because this being a DNG file, it can't be treated in this software directly. And you'll see here with each of these previews, it's updated the various options, and you'll see here that the severe noise model is the one that has the greatest amount of noise reduction. You'll see it's got rid of a lot of this graininess in the background. So clicking on that one and then going to the split view option and allowing it to update, you will see here that on the left is the untreated version of the file, and moving this slider across, you can see the amount of difference it makes. It gets rid of a lot of that film grain look from the image, and without destroying the image totally. And what we've got here is severe noise. Now if I click the auto settings, it will recalculate the amount of noise reduction necessary, but it will also add some sharpening. And what we're going to do here is we're not going to sharpen this image here. We're going to go into Sharpen AI to apply the sharpening to the image, and you'll see now that it's done a pretty good job of getting rid of a lot of that graininess, particularly out of the background. If you look at the before here and also the little boy's face, it's done a really good job of getting rid of that noise, but it hasn't lost and it hasn't blurred the details on his cap. So we will apply that, and that will take just a little time to process. And there it is back into Photoshop, and this is the one that I made earlier using those settings, and I just labeled that severe noise. I'm going to remove that copy because I've already done that work. And then what I would do now is, having applied the denoise to this image, I would now make a duplicate of that layer and then go into the Sharpen AI filter. So again, using Topaz Sharpen AI, and these are really remarkably good pieces of software and well worth the investment if you have images that you need to do a lot of work with. And again, this is opened up, and we have here now in the later versions a whole range of different models. We just move our sample point over here so we can have a look at the boy, and there's a whole lot of different versions. Now if we just selected the option, the auto option, it's decided that the best model is out of focus, very blurry, and you can see that it's actually done a pretty good job of trying to bring back some detail or extract some detail out of the background. And you'll see here that there's quite a lot of detail brought out in the cap and in the sheep, and a little bit of more detail brought out in the little boy's face. Now you can adjust these settings here, and you can experiment with different models. If I went back to the out of focus very noisy model, for instance, it will do a preview of that and then give me a comparison so that I can have a look. And I think in fact the previous one I had, so if we go back to the auto, out of focus very blurry seems to work well on slides. We can apply that setting, and we've now done some denoise and we've done some sharpening. Now depending on the speed of your computer's processor, particularly the sharpening can take quite a while to process, but it does do a fantastic job. And if I just remove that copy again, because I've already done this, denoise, severe noise, and then I've done sharpen, out of focus, very blurry, and we can zoom in and let's have a look at this and how it has affected it. So going back to the original image, you can see quite a lot of grain, quite a lot of noise. The severe noise, denoise version has removed a lot of that, and then with the sharpen AI, it's really enhanced the sharpness, particularly of the boy's cap, and really made that a lot better already. But there's more we can do. The next option we're going to do is we're going to use one of the Nik filters to try and bring out some of the more fine details and textures in the image. And again, this is a third-party piece of software, well worth the investment, and works as a plug-in within Photoshop. And what we're going to use here is Nik Silver Efex Pro, which is normally the monochrome plug-in software, but we use this to enhance some of the detail. And again, if you're not familiar with this piece of software, it's well worth experimenting with. And in here, I'm going to use one of my favorites, which would be the high structure harsh enhancement model. And again, we can see with a slider, we can see how much detail it's bringing out of the image. Forget the fact for the minute that it's monochrome. It's enhanced a lot of the tonal range. So we're going to use that and apply that to the image. And it comes through as a monochrome image. I'll turn that off because I did this a little bit earlier. High structure harsh, and what I've done is I've blended that to luminosity, so that all we're doing with the Nik Silver Efex Pro filter is importing the luminosity values, and you'll see here that it's added quite a lot of mid-range contrast to the image, but at full opacity it's a little bit too much, so we drop that back to somewhere about 50%. That's at full strength. It's a little bit overdone. Somewhere around 50% works pretty well, and it's just brought out some of that mid-tone detail. And then once we've done that, what we want to do is we want to add another Nik filter, and that is the not the Silver Efex, the Color Efex Pro, because we're going to enhance the color information. And by doing that, we'll go into Color Efex Pro, which is another one of the Nik plugins, and this really does a good job on a lot of images in enhancing the color information. And there are a lot of filters within Color Efex Pro. Some of them are great, some of them not so great, but in particular tonal contrast does a great job of trying to enhance the colors and the tonal range. And in this image it's a little bit subtle, but it does make a difference. You can see that it's increased the saturation a little bit and a little bit of the color detail. But I'm also going to add another filter on top of that one, and coming down to the left hand side, selecting one of the other filters, I'm going to select the Pro Contrast filter and just selecting the neutral model, and adding this filter. By default at the neutral model there are no corrections added, but what I do have here is an option to look at some color cast corrections. Now you'll see that the stones in the background have still got a little bit of magenta in them, so I'm going to use that to just remove some of that color cast from the image. and I don't often use the correct contrast because it really does add too much contrast, but the dynamic contrast does sometimes add a little bit of useful additional contrast in the image. And again, it's up to personal taste, but I think that has now helped to remove some of that magenta cast from the background and given us a better overall image. So we'll say OK to run with that, and let's see what the final result is. So again, with these two images or two filters, I've already applied these, so let's just go through, and here's my version with the tonal contrast and the pro contrast added. It has just given a little bit more of a boost to the contrast and enhanced the color a little bit. And then the final thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Photoshop and use one of the neural filters in Photoshop, and I've found that this works particularly well on scanned images, and that is the neural filter called JPEG artifact removal. And here we go into the filters menu, and we may need to make sure that we have a new copy of a background layer to work with. Neural filters, and this is in the later versions of Photoshop. We'll just minimize that Nik tool, and using some of these neural filters will require downloading some additional items from Adobe, but we've already done this. Now I'm looking at the JPEG artifacts removal. We'll have a look at that, and this does take a little bit of processing, but it does do a terrific job of getting rid of a lot of nasty little blemishes from the images, and of course with JPEG images it works extremely well. Now I'm just going to let that process. It takes a few minutes to do, so I'm going to cancel out of this now because I've already done this, and let's just have a look at what has happened. Let's just zoom in and have a look, and you can see that it's smoothed out a lot of those little details that were still a little bit lumpy and gotten rid of some of that stuff. Now you'll notice that I haven't bothered to do anything at all with any of these other little spots. I'm going to do that last of all. So I've now got the image looking really good, and the last thing I really want to do is do some cloning and patching using the patch tools. And I've just made a new layer, and I've done all that patching on a separate layer so that if I make a mistake or I do something wrong, I can go back and delete it. But using the clone and patch tool, simply all we do, let's just do it again, add a new blank layer above here, and for a lot of these background spots using the patch tool is the way to go, and certainly not that size, but simply go down to a very small size and you just simply pick on the spots. And for out of focus background items, this is really great. There are other places where you might need to use the clone tool, and you can just go around and spend a bit of time getting rid of these. Now I've already done this on another layer, but you can see this has all come from either the slide being in storage, or sometimes it's muck that gets onto the film when it's been processed. So I've already done this. Let's have a look at what I did. I got rid of most of it, and you can spend as much time as you like working on this to bring out the detail. So here's our finished file, and if we go back and look at our comparison with our raw file, we've improved it enormously from that. And then if we go back and look at the original scan, you wouldn't expect that we could get that much detail out of the photograph, but yes, you can. And then once that's finished, you can flatten all of those layers and save it out, or in this case I've kept it so that we can use it as an example. So that's how we can restore a transparency or a negative. Let's now have a look at restoring some prints.